General George S. Patton was not a man who often kept his opinions to himself. He was the old blood and guts of the European theater, a commander who believed in reincarnation, destiny, and the sheer brute force of American will. But in October 1944, standing atop a half-track in a muddy field in France, he stared down at a formation of men that the United States Army had never intended to use. They were the 761st Tank Battalion. They were the Black Panthers, and to the military establishment back in Washington, they were a problem. Patton, staring into the faces of these African-American tankers, cleared his throat. His high-pitched voice cut through the damp autumn air. "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those Krautsons." It was a rousing speech, typical of Patton's firebrand style. But behind the bluster lay a nervous tension that few spoke of aloud. Privately, Patton had harbored the same deep-seated prejudices as his peers. In letters to his wife, he had once written that colored soldiers were not capable of thinking fast enough to fight in armor. The 761st had been thrown to him not because he viewed them as a secret weapon, but because the Third Army was bleeding out. They were running out of white men to die in Sherman tanks. What followed over the next 6 months would not only shock Patton, it would shatter the foundational lie of the segregated American military. The story of the 761st is not just a story of combat valor. It is the story of a unit that was terrified to fail because they knew they were fighting two wars, one against Nazi Germany and one against the Tao of their own country, the Jim Crow Army. To understand why the 761st was such an anomaly, one must understand the United States military of the 1940s. It was a rigid apartheid system. Black soldiers were drafted in high numbers but were overwhelmingly relegated to service roles: cooking, driving trucks, digging latrines, and burying the dead. The prevailing scientific racism of the era, codified in war college reports, claimed that African Americans lacked the courage, intelligence, and discipline for mechanized warfare. The 761st was an experiment born of political pressure from black organizations and the sheer necessity of total war. Formed in 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, the men of the 761st were drawn from all walks of life: still workers from Pennsylvania, sharecroppers from the South, students from the North. They were eager to prove their patriotism, but the army seemed determined to break their spirit before they ever saw a German tank. Their training was a gauntlet of humiliation. In the Deep South, they were often treated worse than the German prisoners of war held in nearby camps. German Poes could eat in the local diners. The black American soldiers guarding them had to eat in the kitchen or out back. It was in this crucible that the unit's steel was forged. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, was a white officer who defied the norm. Unlike many white officers assigned to black units, who viewed it as a career-ending punishment, Bates treated his men with respect. He refused to tolerate racism from other white officers and pushed the 761st to be better than standard. He knew they had to be. The unit's spirit was perhaps best exemplified by a young lieutenant named Jack Robinson, later known to the world as Jackie Robinson. Long before he broke the color barrier in baseball, Robinson broke the spirit of Jim Crow at Fort Hood, Texas, refusing to move to the back of a military bus. Though he was court-martialed and eventually acquitted, the incident galvanized the unit. They realized that their war had already begun. Into the fire, Morville. When the 761st finally arrived in France, the skepticism was palpable. Other units looked at them with curiosity or disdain. They were assigned older Model M for Sherman tanks, the Ronsons that lit up every time they were hit, while other units were prioritized for upgrades. Their first test came on November 7, 1944, at the French town of Morville-les-Vicq. The mission was a suicide run, a frontal assault on a heavily fortified German position. The shock that Patton and the High Command experienced began here. The expectation for green troops, especially experimental troops, was that they would freeze under fire or break ranks. Instead, the Black Panthers fought with a ferocity that bordered on reckless. They didn't just take the town. They obliterated the resistance, but the cost was high. It was a chaotic, bloody baptism. One tank commander, Sergeant Roy King, was killed when he climbed out of his tank to clear a jammed machine gun. The men of the 761st realized quickly that the Germans didn't care about the color of their skin. Their 88mm anti-tank guns killed everyone just the same. What surprised the White Infantry divisions they supported the 26th Yankee Division specifically was the 761st's refusal to stop. In standard armored doctrine, a tank unit would fight for a few days and then be pulled off the line for rest and refit. The 761st was kept on the line and they stayed there. The 183-day grind. The secret weapon aspect of the 761st wasn't a piece of technology, it was their endurance. For 183 consecutive days, the battalion remained in combat. They fought through the mud of France, the snow of the Ardennes, and into the heart of the Reich. This operational tempo was unheard of. It was driven by a grim necessity. American commanders, initially reluctant to use them, suddenly found that the 761st was the only armor support they could rely on. The terrified to unleash them sentiment had flipped. Commanders were now terrified to lose them. During the Battle of the Bulge, when the German army launched its massive, desperate counteroffensive, the 761st was thrown into the breach. In sub-zero temperatures, where skin would stick to the frozen steel of the tanks, they hunted German panzers in the whiteout conditions. It was here that the legend of Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was cemented. Rivers was a calm, soft-spoken man from Oklahoma who transformed into a warrior behind the controls of a tank. During the advance toward Gebling, his tank hit a mine, slashing his leg to the bone. The medics ordered him to evacuate. His commanding officer ordered him to go home. Rivers refused. "This is one fight," he reportedly said, "that I'm not going to miss." For 3 days, with a gangrenous leg and in agonizing pain, Rivers commanded his tank, covering the retreat of other American forces and holding off German assaults. He eventually died when his tank was blown apart by German artillery. He had essentially traded his life for the safety of his platoon. It would take more than 50 years for his country to award him the Medal of Honor, the truth buried in the snow. As the 761st pushed further into Germany, piercing the Siegfried Line and crossing the Rhine, a strange phenomenon occurred. The racial barriers that defined American life began to dissolve in the face of shared death. White infantrymen, pinned down by machine gun fire, stopped caring that the tank saving them was driven by a black man. They cheered when the Black Panthers rolled up. They shared cigarettes and rations. The shock for Patton, and indeed for the entire military structure, was not just that black men could fight, but that they could lead. The 761st destroyed hundreds of German vehicles and inflicted thousands of casualties. They were capturing towns that white units had failed to take. But the most harrowing moment for the battalion came near the end of the war. In May 1945, the 761st was one of the first American units to reach the Gunskirchen concentration camp in Austria. These men, who had grown up under the threat of lynching and the oppression of Jim Crow, stared through the barbed wire at the victims of the Holocaust. The irony was devastating. They were liberating skeletal survivors of a regime built on racial supremacy, while wearing the uniform of a country that legally treated them as second-class citizens. One 761st veteran recalled the smell of death at Gunskirchen, a smell that never left him. They handed out their rations to the starving prisoners, weeping openly. In that moment, the geopolitical narrative of the war collided with the personal reality of their lives. They had defeated the ultimate form of racism abroad, yet they knew what awaited them at home: the silence of victory. When the war ended, the shock wore off, and the status quo returned with a vengeance. The 761st Tank Battalion had racked up a combat record that rivaled any white unit in the European theater. They had 4 campaign ribbons, 11 silver stars, and nearly 300 Purple Hearts. But there was no ticker tape parade for the Black Panthers. When they disembarked the ships in New York, the flags were waved, but the welcome home signs were not for them. Many were denied service in diners on their train rides home. Some were beaten by police for wearing their uniforms in the South. The truth that Patton had seen the undeniable equality of valor was buried. The army downplayed their achievements. The official history books glossed over their 183 days of hell. Patton himself died in a car accident shortly after the war, taking whatever final evolution of his racial views to the grave. But the secret he had unleashed could not be fully contained. The performance of the 761st, along with the Tuskegee Airmen and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team Japanese Americans, created a pressure cooker that President Harry Truman could not ignore. In 1948, armed with the undeniable data of their performance, Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. Conclusion: the 761st Tank Battalion was never meant to be the spearhead of the Third Army. They were a token gesture, a political concession that the brass hoped would quietly fail or serve in the rear. The buried truth of American military history is that integration wasn't an act of benevolence, it was an act of survival. The U.S. military could not afford to ignore the fighting capacity of 10% of its population. Patton, for all his flaws, recognized a killer when he saw one. He feared unleashing them because he knew that once black men tasted the agency of combat, the power of the tank, the authority of the gun, and the undeniable proof of their own courage, they would never again accept the role of the servant. They came out fighting, as their motto promised, and in doing so, they forced America to look in the mirror. The tragedy is not that it took a world war for them to prove their worth. The tragedy is that they had to prove it at all. When the last tank of the 761st rolled off the battlefield, the secret was out. Courage has no color. And the only thing more dangerous than a panzer tank is a man who knows he is fighting for his right to exist.